All right, go for it.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's the one, the oldie, the Bananarama himself, the guerrilla economist, and I am live with the master of the flux capacitor, CJ, working the airways and the dilithium crystals and flux capacitors. It's that time of the month, and you know who it is. It's none other than Charles Hugh Smith of Two Minds Blog. Charles, welcome back, sir. It is a pleasure to have you on again.
Thank you, V. It's my pleasure as well. And you know that we share one goal, which is to completely disrupt the status quo. And that's a positive
Absolutely,
goal.
because that's what it's all about. Yeah, absolutely, my man. And that's what it's all about. Because if we're not finding, look, if we don't create pathways for ourselves and find alternatives to the system will find alternatives for us.
Right. And I think it's becoming clearer the more, anybody that reads anything from the 75% decline in the number of insects in Germany, or the China strategy to support their housing bubble. They're now buying almost a quarter of all those empty flats that they're building.
Yeah.
The governments are buying the flats because there's no organic demand. We see all this craziness. It's obvious that the status quo kind of economy we have, whatever you want to call it, is dying. It's dying. And so there's going to be another system. Something is going to replace the arrangement we have now. And so what we're really trying to do is we're trying to lay out a positive alternative, before the thing completely falls apart, because then people will have a template that they can follow.
Absolutely correct, my man. Absolutely correct. The status quo is completely lost it. They've gone bonkers. Look at the Japanese, the BOJ. The Bank of Japan continues to buy not only stocks, but bonds of companies that are defunct and rife with fraud, like Nipponto, who's a company that's been facing massive investigations for fraud. They've issued junk bonds, and who's buying it? The Bank of Japan. The reason why they're doing this, Charles, I mean, you and I are on the same page on this. We are in an insolvent world. Any sort of fictitious liquidity that can be gleaned is liquidity that they so desire. It's this rush for anything. They're like a bunch of starving vampires. It seems like these banks.
Yeah, and we know why these central banks are buying all this phantom assets. Is they're desperate to prop up the collateral. The sense that all this is really worth what the price is today. And of course, that's not price discovery, and nobody really knows what any of this stuff is worth, based on fundamentals like price to earnings ratios and how much profit does the enterprise or the thing generate. Obviously, virtually everything is in a bubble. That's why you see around the internet, you see all these charts that it was like the .com bubble, then the housing bubble, and now we're in the everything bubble. And I think that's a pretty good description.
I agree wholeheartedly, man. We are definitely in the everything bubble. There's no doubt about it. It was one of the heads over at Bank of England a few years ago that said we've blown the largest bubble in human history, and they're absolutely correct about that. Charles, what's on your radar, man? What's the latest? What's going on with you?
Well, two things occurred to me that just, looking at headlines and, on Zero Hedge, they had Ray Dalio, one of the most successful hedge fund managers in history, and, considered a really smart guy and a successful guy. And he comes out and basically says we have two economies, right? And I basically have been saying the same thing for years, and a lot of us have been saying the same thing, which is, the bottom 90% of households live in one economy and the top 10% live in another one. And, those of us who have a foot in each camp, we can see it, but the vast majority of people who are in the media, the technocrat class, the entrepreneurial class, the people who are in the top 10% that earned their way there, they think, well, hey, I'm here. I did it. What's the problem? And they're the ones who, of course, run the media. They run the tech companies. They are the top bureaucrats in the government. And so we have this sort of echo chamber that at the top 10%, it's everybody saying, well, everything's great for me, so it's great for everybody, right? You know, you too can work hard and, you know, blah, blah. But then if you're in the bottom 80% or even the bottom 90%, you're working your butt off. You know, you've got student loans, you did the right things, or so what you were told was correct, right? You went out and borrowed 100 grand and got a college degree, and now you're slaving away for corporate America or the government or something, and you're not really getting ahead. You know, you're doing all the right stuff, but you're not really getting ahead. You're not going to turn your net wealth of 100,000 into millions, right? And you're taking your income, whatever it is, it's very hard to save enough to become one of that top 5%, right? And so to me, it's like the ladder of social mobility has been broken, right? I mean, a few people still, you know, climb up the greasy pole, you know, and and these people are the ones who are trumpeted in the press. It's like, oh, well, anybody can do this. See, this guy did it. You know, he worked 4 jobs and you know, blah, blah, blah. And then he had a brilliant idea and now he's a millionaire. But in actual fact, it used to be a lot easier to get to a point of economic security. Now it's becoming such a challenge that very few people can make it, right? Or somebody gets halfway up the ladder and then they get sick, or their spouse loses their job, or, you know, some other thing that used to be survivable. Now you can't survive it. You end up living in an RV, you know? So it's interesting.
The whole
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Charles.
No, I was just going to say, when Ray Dalio starts talking about this, then we can start talking about it, because he's big enough that you know, people can't ignore what he says.
Absolutely correct, man. And I think the real culprit here is central bank, because the central bank has devalued currency to such an alarming extent. I mean, what is it right now? The dollar's been devalued about 98% of its purchasing power since 1913, and here we are on this radio broadcast telling people that the last remaining 2% of purchasing power that you have is going to vanish as well, and people look at us like we're crazy. And folks, I mean, the thing is this: back in the days, you had a purchasing power, so whatever money you earned, you put it away. About it being inflated away. Today, we have this fiat currency is based on inflated, you know, money printing, quantitative twist and TARP and NERP and SERP, you name it. And then on top of that, you know, Americans don't buy hard assets. They don't buy anything that's some sort of a security blanket, God forbid, in some sort of a catastrophe. So when catastrophe does show up, everything they have just goes right down the toilet, man.
Right. And you're right about the money. And I often say, if you don't change the way we create and distribute money, then you change nothing. You change nothing. You can talk about ecological Armageddon, and you can talk about wealth inequality. You can talk about all the things that are wrong with our society and economy. None of it changes unless you change the way that money is created and distributed. And in our system, it's created and distributed at the very apex of the wealth power pyramid, right? You're a central banker, you're a private sector banker, you're a financier, you're a major corporation. You get basically unlimited free credit. And with that free credit, you can go buy up real world assets, and you can outbid anybody. And so you end up owning the real world. And that's exactly what we got, right? Like the Fed just came out with this big report, right? And it was, and like all propaganda, it starts out with some sort of happy story about how the GDP grew 2.2% every year, and yay.
Wow.
And then you dig down deeper into page 13, and then you discover that 77% of all the wealth of the nation is owned by the top 10%. And the vast majority of that 77% is owned by the top 5%. And of that, the vast majority is owned by the top 1%. And of that, the top 1/10%. So, you know, you can use average income gains and, you know, median income gains, and all this stuff goes up by 2%, and we're supposed to be cheering. But if you look deeper into the thing, you find out the average middle class household gained since like 2010 or whatever, you know, it gained like $21,000 in net worth, you know, and like that's the whole recovery. Meanwhile, the top guys are up by 700,000. And we're not talking people making, you know, billionaires. We're just talking like, you know, the top cream of people who own businesses, who own apartment buildings, who own, big chunks of stocks and bonds, multimillionaire types. And so so the rich are getting richer, right? And it's because they have access to the free money. So, I mean, if you and I each got $1 billion line of credit at 0% interest, we could be rich too, right?
That's an interesting point you make, man. I even look at some of the big Wall Street companies. Like, I was breaking my head the other day wondering why. It was a few days ago. I mean, we a lot of people on Wall Street, a lot of proponents on Wall Street, they're like, well, Apple Computers is sitting on 150 billion in cash. What a cash-rich company. And I'm saying to myself, here is a company. Why are they sitting on 150 billion dollars in cash, and they're not reinvesting it? They're not expanding themselves. They're not in an era of 0% interest. Why are they not doing anything with it? And I was looking at it, and I'm thinking to myself, Apple, just like Wall Street, they ran out of ideas, man.
Yeah, that's right.
They ran out of ideas. They are basically sitting and wait. Maybe that's their slush fund when this whole thing goes pop. Yeah. And they buy smaller companies on pennies on the dollar. Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, but it's true, and that the two economies we're talking about. If you have like a family wealth fund of like 50 million or 100 million bucks, which isn't that uncommon in the States, right? And in other developed economies, China, Europe, Japan, what are you going to do with the money? And the average household, people might think, oh, well, you go buy a yacht, or, you buy a luxury, a third home, or you buy, big diamond or something like that. And that's really not what the wealthy people do. They're totally obsessed with like preserving their wealth. They're not really, they already own the yacht and the house and all that stuff. That's chump change, right? I mean, you can buy a pretty nice vacation home for what, $2 million bucks. And if that's 5% of your net worth, and so what? Okay, so now what are you going to do with the rest of your money? You're going to try to preserve it. And they're running around the world trying to find something that's profitable. And there isn't that much left, because the valuations are so high. So even being rich is no protection against betting on a bubble,
No, exactly correct, man. Exactly correct. Being rich doesn't mean you sit there and you bet on a bubble and you believe that the bubble is actually real, or there's actually real wealth there with nothing but phantom wealth to begin with.
Right, exactly, phantom wealth. And so let's just change gears and talk about something that we were talking about before we started recording, which was the strange sort of emotional divide that's created by Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and it's either a love it or hate it kind of thing. And there's almost nobody who can maintain their rationality and say, well, yeah, I see there's pros and cons here, or everybody either is saying it's a Ponzi scheme and look out below, and and some Saudi prince comes out and say it's like Enron. And and you list, what can you say, right? All these guys who are totally committed and whose wealth is dependent on the existing status quo. Surprise, surprise, they hate Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies.
Yep.
Why is that not? Why are we not surprised?
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. It's why are we not surprised? It's don't Bitcoin has no credibility. But who was it? Some idiot over at the ECB that said that Bitcoin is really not currency. It doesn't have all the all the functions of currency. I'm like, it's unreal, man.
Yeah, and so and the thing I think I try to stress to my audience is I don't claim to have a crystal ball. I don't know where the cryptocurrency and blockchain technologies are going. It's so early in the game, and a lot of people say the same thing. Our predictive powers are really limited, right? We can't predict how it's going to turn out, but a lot of us feel that it's eventually going to become the sort of a parallel to the internet in terms of its ability to transform the way we do things, right? And so it's not just about whether who's going to get rich or who's going to be kicked off the gravy train, although those are certainly interesting questions. It's like, how is it going to improve the security of everyday people in everyday life? And that's part of our interest, in blockchain technology, right? It's not just, well, who's going to get rich or who's going to get kicked off the gravy train. We hope that Jamie Dimon and the Saudi princes are kicked off the gravy train. I mean, that's definitely a big wish of mine, is that it disrupts the banking sector and the central banks and destroys them. And so then we can go back to a decentralized form of currency, you know, that's not centralized.
My hope and prayer as well, these guys are finally kicked off. And that's the whole thing that people need to think. This whole world's about to be upside down. Tables are about to be flipped. And these guys are terrified. It seems as they won't place the come with some sort of serious honesty.
Right. You're breaking up a little bit on my end.
Oh, could you hear me?
Yeah, you were breaking up on my end a bit too.
Oh, I apologize. What I was I think the fear that these guys have is that, number one, so the tables are about to be flipped, and these guys are terrified that they will not have room on the table for themselves, or if they do, if there is room, they need to come to the table. Then they need to show their cards. They need to be honest about it, and that's something that these guys, these characters, are absolutely terrified about.
Right. Exactly. It's the emperor has no clothes syndrome. You know, like, what's the actual foundation of their claim on wealth? You know, and so in the case of Jamie Dimon and the bankers, it's playing intermediaries, right? They get to skim a percentage of all the money that flows throughout the global economy, right? They get their piece of the transaction, or a piece of the interest, or a piece of the origination fee. And so if you eliminate the middleman and the intermediary, you eliminate virtually all of the banking sector. And that would be a huge bonus, right? Because all that money would then stay in the hands of the people who need to transact some sort of business or transaction. So that would be a huge plus. It would be like a tax break if we got rid of the banking sector.
Yeah, absolutely correct, man. Charles, what do you thought
well, you know,
the latest news with the crypto markets?
Well, you know, it's of course really obvious, but because it's so obvious, we don't necessarily notice it anymore. But it's like this constant propaganda attack on Bitcoin and the cryptocurrencies by these very wealthy status quo guys. You know, the Jamie Dimons, the Saudi princes, various central bankers. And yet Bitcoin, so Bitcoin always drops a couple $100 or 10% or whatever it drops, right? On this attack by some so-called, authority figure. And then like a week or two or a month later, hey, it's hitting a new high. I mean, doesn't anybody else notice this pattern? I think they notice it, you know?
Absolutely.
And and I think it's worth talking about, you know, when you look at Facebook feeds and Twitter and stuff like that, and the people who hate Bitcoin or don't understand it or some combination of that, they often call it a Ponzi scheme. And it's not really a Ponzi scheme because that's a misreading of what that means. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about, you know, what's a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme is what Bernie Madoff was doing, which is you take $1 million from somebody and you distribute that $1 million as dividends to a new raft of chumps, right? So they think, wow, I'm really earning 20% here. This is great. Then they go tell their friends and you get a whole nother raft of chumps. And you're basically using the income stream to pay out a fake dividend. It's just like phantom, right? You're actually just taking somebody's investment and you're distributing it as a dividend. That's a Ponzi scheme. Bitcoin is like a lot of other people have said, there is no metaphor or analogy that explains Bitcoin. You can't say it's like a stock or it's like a commodity or it's like a Ponzi scheme. It's like, it is what it is. It's a unique, individual, special thing. And you can't really explain it by calling it something else, you know, and this is why it's difficult for a lot of people to grasp what it is. And I myself don't make any claims of expertise. It's like, I'm still feeling my way around it. It obviously has features of currency, but it also has features of of like a commodity because it's limited, right? You can't print any more of it. And so we're all kind of struggling to figure out what exactly it is, but a good place to start is it's not like anything else. So labeling it like a Ponzi scheme, you're simply obfuscating it. You can disagree with it, you can think it's worthless or whatever, but you have to start with the fact that it's not a Ponzi scheme, and it's not like anything else, and it's not like a fiat currency either. It's something new, and so we're going to have to understand it as something new. And you know, we simply are confusing things by trying to find the correct analogy. It's kind of like if in 1994 somebody just tried to describe the internet as it's kind of like a phone but with a screen. Well, that's some sort of version of the internet, but it's not really describing what the internet is, or you know. So anyways, that's something that I think we're still in this stage where everybody's confused about what it is we're talking about, and it makes it hard to get any clarity on these issues, whether you're pro or con.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think what's happening is this is such a new thing because not only does it have aspects of a currency and a commodity, but the most incredible thing is that it is the technology. It's a commodity, a currency, and all of it is built and tied together on a technology that is absolutely revolutionizing the entire world. And that's why they just simply can't quantify it, because we've had over 100 years of absolute BS, you know, that's been posing as fundamental economics.
Right.
And it really is a change of the game.
Yeah. And, you know, I just read a piece where someone was describing the emotional zeitgeist of the German hyperinflation, you know, the famous German hyperinflation that led to the rise of the Nazis.
Yeah, the Weimar.
Yeah, the Weimar Republic. And that it was a speculative frenzy. In other words, people were buying basically the same old story, you know, the tulip bulbs or whatever. And what happens is when you substitute a speculative excess for real prosperity, you know, that's what we've got now, right? We're not really creating any more goods and services. Like you said, companies like Apple are simply buying back their own shares. They're not reinvesting it in anything because there's so few opportunities to make more profit than they already make, right? And so it's all this speculative frenzy is not a substitute for actually creating a better world, a more sustainable world, a more prosperous world. And none of that's, there's no dynamic at all in speculative excess to create the world that we all want. And so that's where we're at. And the thing about blockchain and Bitcoin is actually, in my mind, it's a speculation killer. I mean, people look at it and go, well, it's, you know, it's rising by leaps and bounds and it's a speculative excess. Well, that may be, but there's a limited number of Bitcoin will ever be produced. And so eventually it serves as a store of value simply because it has scarcity value. And people say, well, you know, I can't buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin. And it's sort of like, well, yeah, but you can easily transfer your Bitcoin into dollars and then buy your cup of coffee with $1. So, you know, it's like, as long as there's convertibility between fiat currencies and cryptocurrencies, then, you know, everyone's saying, well, I can't use Bitcoin to buy XYZ. Well, you don't need to. It takes like 10 seconds to convert your Bitcoin into dollars and then buy whatever you want with dollars. That's like saying, you know, that's what the whole global foreign exchange market is about. You take whatever currency you got, and you convert it into something else, and then you buy what you want, and end of story. That's not what defines a currency, is whether you can buy a cup of coffee with it.
No, exactly correct, man. It's
I mean, I can't buy a cup of coffee with an ounce of gold either, you know? I mean,
but it's money.
Yeah, but it's money.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so well, what are you seeing that's different in the cryptocurrency space in terms of new ideas or new developments or new craziness?
Man, I think the ever continuing attempts to create you know, cryptocurrency ETFs. We've had iLedger, which you know, this past week they did over $1 million. I think, I don't know, $1 million or $18 million in transactions, and that's an ETF, on Bitcoin. So there's these attempts, and it amazes me how people think that the best way to transact or get involved in something like a cryptocurrency would be to get an ETF. You're not solving the problem here. And I think between that and all the fake ICOs with these fake coins, I remember I forgot which one it was, but it was an ICO that lasted literally raised some capital, and then the whole coin lasted maybe 3 months before the whole thing was shut down. So stuff like that, But it's a good thing. All these things need to happen because we're in uncharted territory here.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing, Charles.
Yeah. If you don't mind me raising another topic is, it seems like every time I turn around, there's another article by some quasi expert or whatever claiming that the government is going to shut down Bitcoin because it's a threat to fiat currencies. And
if they do that, all they'll do is create demand.
Yeah, exactly.
Please shut it down if you can, and you can't do it.
And it's called the Streisand effect. That's one of the elements we're talking about here, which was named after Barbara Streisand because there was some sort of. Have you heard of the Streisand effect? It's an interesting story. It's based on the idea that some obscure government agency in California was photographing the entire coast, for scientific purposes. And then Barbara Streisand found out that there was a photo of her beach shorefront estate in Southern California. And so she sued the agency to delete the photos of her estate. And then there was before she sued the agency, there 12 people had viewed the photo of her estate. Afterward, it went to 5 million in a few hours, right? And so when you try to ban something and then you're actually creating all this visibility about it, and then people start going, wow, what's going on, And so there's certainly that. But I wrote today also that, who's owning the cryptocurrencies in amounts that really matter. And I'm proposing that it's the wealthy people are glomming onto Bitcoin and the other primary cryptocurrencies, if nothing else, as a hedge, because they're not dumb. They see exactly what we see, that this is all phantom wealth. It's all bubbles, the everything bubble. And so they're going to be buying cryptocurrencies, and the difference between them buying it and me buying it or you buying it is not just the volume they can buy, but they have political power. Okay, they're the ones who fund all the Congress people's campaigns and all their phony, philanthro capitalist foundations and all that stuff. So, how are you gonna destroy the wealth of the people that you depend on? That's basically what people are saying when they say the government's going to ban Bitcoin. It's like, well, wait a minute. Who defines what the government's goal is, what the government's priorities are? It's the people with wealth and power, right? It's not the voters. You're kidding me, right? Well, that's a joke. So if the wealthy and the powerful are buying cryptocurrencies, why are they going to let their government ban their form of wealth? I mean, it makes zero sense, Mm-hmm. So anyways, that's my thought for today is the super wealthy are glomming onto Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and I think they're going to start soaking up so much of the available inventory that there's going to be less and less available for the rest of us. Because if they look at Bitcoin and Dash and Ethereum as just another form of wealth, then it's going to go the same way that everything else does. They're going to own most of it. And then they're not going to let the government destroy that form of their wealth. So those of us who can still try to get a piece of it, it makes sense simply from that dynamic. I just don't think that the super wealthy who influence the government are going to let some government agency ban Bitcoin if they in fact are heavily invested in it. That's not the way our political system works.
Yeah, exactly correct. Charles, a lot of things are happening in the Middle East, man. What's your take?
Oh, the Middle East. Right. I don't know if this is relevant, but I was just reading this history by this guy that was in MI5, the English security agency, along with MI6, and he was a high-level guy and dealt with the NSA and the FBI and the CIA, and I just don't know that what we're told or that is true or meaningful. I think it's so complicated, and there's so much intrigue and so many layers of players and hidden influence. I really don't know whether we know enough to even say what the heck's going on in something as complicated as Kurdistan, the Kurdish proto-state, or the Syrian Badlands. I mean, what's going on out there? Who's really in charge? Who's buying who? Who's funding who? I think it would be I would hesitate to even claim that what we're told in the mainstream media has any validity at all. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to say.
It's so funny to me that you had what is happening in Syria and the whole entire thing that they try to do with the the Kurds.
Yeah.
And that whole entire pipe dream they had with the Kurds, and now they realize that whole entire stunt has fallen apart. And the deep state's dream of having a Kurdistan has completely fallen to pieces, man. And the U.S. foreign policy is completely, the schizophrenic foreign policy has come to an end, man.
God, it's hard to know, I mean, certainly the U.S. foreign policy is a catastrophe, but it's because we're always trying to meddle in everything, and we often seem to have a knack for picking the most destructive, pathological liars and dictators as our good buddies. Talk about a losing strategy. But yeah, it's really hard to sort out because there's so many players, like just the whole Kurdistan thing and the Kurdish desire for their own independent state, which from their point of view, they were cheated back when Britain and France carved up the Middle East, and basically drew some lines on a map and said, oh, well, we're going to call this country Iraq. And it's all like, well, that's nice. What did you do? Well, we used a pencil and a ruler. It's like, yeah, but did you look at the tremendous complexity of the ethnicities and the religions and all this cultural complexity? Oh no, we just drew a line with a pencil and a ruler. And it's all like, well, guess why we have so much turmoil? It all goes back to that, right? That you create these countries like the way you create money out, by a fiat decision. And so there's all these people that have an interest, right? And they all have a legitimate interest. I mean, Turkey, Iran, the Kurds themselves, Syrians, the government in Iraq. I mean, there's all these people have a legitimate interest. And then there's the other players, Russia and China and the US. And so it's all like, wow, talk about a mulligan stew of a brew that's going to take a while to get sorted. Because, I don't think the Kurds have given up their desire. And I don't think that I think they're probably, they're feeling that they were ripped off by the colonial West it seems to me to be fairly legitimate.
Yeah, absolutely correct, man. Another death blow to the cabal, Charles, is that China's announcement that they're launching a petro yuan with a gold trade settlement. Wow, that's huge.
Well, I love it. I love anything that introduces another currency, and anything that's backed by something other than nothing is an interesting innovation. And so I hope it becomes available for everybody on the planet to buy a chunk of it.
Yep. Absolutely. Last but not least, we have Trump is going to be releasing the JFK documents. My take on it, I think it's going to be a lot of Sharpies, and I think you're going to have 3,000 pages released. I think there's going to be a lot of redactions, a lot of Sharpie action going on front to back, and it's going to have 4 words. It's going to have just this sentence in various places. Lee Harvey Oswald did it. and magic bullet all over. Everything else is going to be redacted.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting that it's taken what is this, 60 years or whatever? Yeah, yeah, 65. Yeah. And so a lot of people think that it will fuel conspiracy theories, but I think they should have noticed that conspiracy theories were fueled by the Warren report and all the unanswered questions that have been lying around for the last 60 years.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, interesting stuff.
Charles, what else is on your radar?
Well, as always, I think my focus is always on trying to understand the consequences to our society and culture to these, like the central bank policies and the way that the status quo operates, and so I just think like I read this kind of depressing piece about a bunch of seniors, people like baby boomers who had already retired, but in the 2008 meltdown, they lost their house and they're living in an RV off their Social Security, which isn't enough, and so they're working in an Amazon warehouse now. They're like 71 years old, and apparently there's lots of painkillers and Tiger Balm and stuff around the place because all these old people get sore. And then, they're making like $10 an hour or something. And this is their life now. And I think we all have to be grateful that we hope we don't end up, like that at 71, but a lot of people do. And it wasn't because they didn't work hard or they weren't smart enough or whatever. They just did what they were told and what they thought was right. And so I look at this, like the small towns that are ravished by opioid addiction and the decline in people's lifespans, right? People are getting sick and they're dying a lot younger than they used to. And then you go back and you go, well, what happened to their whole economy? And you go, okay, well, in a nutshell, it was sort of like this. They used to have a main street, a bunch of independent businesses, and those independent business owners would then fund the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, and they'd support the church, and they would support the parade to the town square, and there was actually a community, right? It was actually built up of people who there was a social cohesiveness to the town. Okay, so then Walmart comes in with a lot of cheap stuff made overseas, and then it blows away the whole thing. It destroys all of Main Street. Main Street's a desert. There's nobody left to fund a parade to the town square or anything because Walmart doesn't fund that stuff. All the money goes to Walmart, right? So there's no profit or overhead left in the town, right? Then now we're finding that Walmart is closing in these communities because they can't make their big fat profit margins, so they're just closed. So now the model that we're told is so wonderful is then people are working for minimum wage in an Amazon warehouse 300 miles away. And so the entire culture of these towns is now going to be based on UPS or the Amazon delivery truck or the mail truck coming and dropping their goodies off at their doorstep. So there's not even Walmart's gone. So there's no social center left. There's no social life. There's no social cohesion. The community's been completely destroyed. And then we're supposed to be cheering. Well, I'm not cheering, there's huge consequences of this model. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm not cheering. Yeah, I'm definitely not cheering either, man, because my whole thing is this. It's like you're talking about these large big box retailers, these large companies are coming into these small communities, eviscerating mom and pop businesses, eviscerating the entire economic what's the word I'm looking for? The economic structure, the economic balance of nature, so to speak, the economic culture.
Right.
Let's be honest here, the economic culture of a certain area, decimating it, and then when they can't make their ends meet, they're out. And now the entire towns and villages that relied on this big monolith always being there, well, the monolith is gone, and now the town is left with nothing. It is terrible. It is ravaging. This is why it's so important for people to support as many small businesses as possible.
That's right.
It's terrible, man.
Right, right. And so if you only focus on maximizing profit by whatever means are available, and lowest price always, then this is what you end up with. You know, a bunch of people addicted to opioids waiting for something to be delivered from Amazon, and it's all paid for by some sort of social welfare, right? Because now that we've destroyed the community economy, well, then there's nothing to tax, and so everybody's poor. And they've lost the skills of self-reliance, you know. And so, yeah, if this is why I say the status quo is dying. This is the net result. This is the end state, you know. This is what you get.
Totally. Charles, your closing comments, my man. Go for it. And how people can follow you.
Okay, come visit me at of2minds.com, where I know I'm sounding depressing at the moment, but actually what I really am right about is solutions, because we don't have to live this way. There's lots of other better ways to live.
Absolutely.
And so come to of2minds.com and see what's and share in the solution process, not just the doom and gloom process.
Absolutely correct. With that being said, folks, you can find us on roguemoney.net and check us out on Twitter @TheRogueMoney. Take it away, CJ.